Today's scripture is Proverbs chapter 8, verses 12 through 21. I, wisdom, live with prudence, and I attain knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. I have good advice and sound wisdom. I have insight, I have strength. By me kings reign, and rulers decree what is just. By me rulers rule, and nobles all who govern rightly. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and prosperity. My fruit is better than gold, even fine gold, and my yield is better than choice silver. I walk in the way of righteousness, along the paths of justice, endowing with wealth those who love me and filling their treasuries. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I'm glad I'm not the only one coughing out there. That's good. All right. Well, so we're going to talk about wisdom and what that means for the next couple of Sundays. But first, I want to just admit that I am a big fan of YouTube. And that will make sense in a minute, I promise. So, and because whenever I want to learn or do something, I have discovered that somebody else has probably already learned or discovered something, and they've made a video about it on YouTube. So recently I was talking with my fiance, Emily, and she's been driving my car around, and I have Apple CarPlay, and she does not. And that is a big problem, apparently, now in our house, because she very much wants Apple CarPlay. And I'm like, I bet you we can solve this problem without having to buy a brand new car. And so I started Googling and got on YouTube, and there's like, okay, here's what you go buy, and here's how you retrofit it, and all that sort of stuff to get the CarPlay into the car that she has. And I looked at it and I said, that doesn't look that hard. I bet I can figure that out. I mean, I do have a degree in computer science. It's got to be good for something, right? And if it's not to upgrade your car stereo, I don't know what it's for. So I have the part at home, and I've watched the video 3 times. I will let you know next week how well that worked out. But I'm feeling fairly confident. And sometimes that's all we need is to feel confident, is to feel like we have a little bit of knowledge about what it is that we are trying to do. And so we can find online all kinds of little interesting facts and tidbits and quick fixes and solutions to all sorts of things. And sometimes that is all that we need, because all we need is just a little bit of technical know-how to know how to do the thing that we want to do. And it is a blessing to live in a time when we have so much knowledge at our fingertips. If you knew how much of the sermons come from Wikipedia, not really, kind of. It's really helpful as far as researching people and all that kind of stuff goes. But there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And so we're not talking necessarily about knowledge, which is the idea of filling our heads with facts and figures and know-how and technical skills and all that sort of things. Instead, we want to talk about wisdom. And wisdom is something different, and it is talked about in a very specific way in the Bible, and it's similar to how we use it today. So knowledge is distinct from wisdom in a lot of ways. And one of the most oft-quoted quotes about it is, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in your fruit salad. Right? I mean, that's kind of the gist of what we're going for today. So the book of Proverbs, even though it's full of bunch of these tiny little sayings, is really an attempt to encapsulate wisdom in a way that is easy for us as the reader to digest. And Proverbs was written over several centuries, and it kind of became much like the book of Psalms, which is right next to it, which is a collection of hymns. Proverbs is a collection of these little sayings that people found useful and that seemed to communicate something important. And oftentimes, even though if you move forward and read in the book of Proverbs, all these little sayings that it has, they can seem fairly straightforward, Most of them encapsulate some sort of deeper wisdom, deeper understanding of the world that is far more in depth than the couple of sentences you may be reading on the page. When the scripture approaches the topic of wisdom, we encounter wisdom in usually a couple of different ways. One, especially in the Old Testament, wisdom is really thought about and talked about as this idea of when we are being wise, we are really what we're doing is we are thinking in the way that God thinks, right? That the wisdom we find in the world really is places where we find the evidence of God's mind and how God thinks about things. Now, interestingly, whenever the scripture talks about God's might or strength or anything like that, the Old Testament uses male pronouns. In the book of Proverbs, when we're talking about wisdom and the mind of God and God's wisdom, it switches and it uses female pronouns. The wives and the mothers and all of you out there can make of that what you will. But it's interesting, and it's one of the places where we actually do consistently find any sort of like female representation or female understanding when it talks about God and the being and the ways of God. God's wisdom is often portrayed in the female. That doesn't really have much to do with anything as far as today go. I just thought it was interesting. The other way, husbands, you can deal with that when you get home. The other way that we talk about God's wisdom, especially in the New Testament, is in the person of Christ. That really, Christ's work in the world, when Christ came to teach and be in the world with us and show us, as we call, the way, that was really Jesus here on earth showing us what God's wisdom looks like when it is lived out in the world, and we are truly following in the path that God would have us follow. John Wesley, in his notes on this part of Scripture, talks about this duality, and this idea that wisdom is both talked about as God's mind, but also talked about when we talk about Jesus. And when we talk about Jesus and the importance of Jesus and the role of Jesus, Wesley wrote, the role of Jesus, which was to impart the mind and will of God to mankind. Jesus really is the way that we are chosen to follow. And the way that we see in our Gospels Jesus moving through the world is Jesus moving through the world with the wisdom and the mind of God. And so that is why we say Jesus is the way that we are all called to follow. That all sounds great. And in practice, most of us would have to acknowledge it's fairly difficult. Because while it's simple and easy to ask the question that was all so trendy like 30 years ago, what would Jesus do? We also have to then follow that up with the confession that 90% of the time the answer is, I have no idea. So how do we live with wisdom? How do we live with God, live with God's mind? How do we move through the world in that way? And take all this amazing knowledge that we have at our fingertips and turn it into something far more useful as far as going and doing the work God calls us to do. So I was doing some stuff on this. I ran across a couple of different thinkers and theologians talking about it, and they talked about different aspects of wisdom and how basically wisdom works on a practical basis and what we need to do, what we need to have, what we need to practice in order to live a wise life and live with God's mind. And again, like most of the things we will talk about, it seems fairly straightforward on the surface, but if we really think about it, we will have to admit that it's actually fairly difficult to live in this way, and it's fairly different than how we typically live. And so how I kind of decided to summarize it as I was going through all of this is that wisdom works when we are moving through the world with empathy, scrutiny, which we'll talk about next week, diversity, mystery, and longevity. I liked it because they all ended with wise. And I will confess, I broke out the thesaurus to figure out how to make them all end with wise because I thought that was fun. Sometimes I get bored. Today, though, what we want to talk about is the idea of what does it look like to move through the world with empathy and longevity. And we're going to talk about the other three next week. Cliffhanger. Empathy is fairly straightforward and something that hopefully most of us have some sort of idea about what that means. Empathy means that we actually do try to, instead of only seeing things in the world and what's going on around us through our own eyes and own experiences, try to understand what's going on around us and how it may be, how other people may be experiencing it differently. I don't experience them. I might be standing right next to somebody else, and we may be seeing and experiencing the same thing. We may be receiving the same knowledge and the same information at the same time. But what that means to me, after my life and all the experiences that I've had, is probably going to be different than what that person sitting next to me is going to experience it as. And the challenge is recognizing that that is true. That something that seems straightforward to me may not feel straightforward to the person next to me, or the person next to me may have some history or some trauma or some baggage around something that for me doesn't mean much of anything. Empathy is a calling that we have to basically put ourselves in another person's shoes. And if we're honest about it, we will recognize that that's actually really hard to do. In fact, almost impossible. So practicing empathy in a daily life takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, which is why most of us really don't do it. But if we want to be wise in the way that God is wise, one of the things that we understand and know is that God knows what we are going through. It's one of those things, one of those pieces that that comfort that we take, that when we are happy and glad and joyful, God knows it and God is experiencing it with us. And when we are sad and grieving and struggling, God knows that too. And God is in the grief and the struggle too. That is the hope that we take from our faith. God is infinite in his ability to be empathetic. We are not. We actually have to work on it. So the other thing we want to talk about is this idea of longevity. Now, we live in a time and a place where, again, everything's at our fingertips. And if I want to know how to put CarPlay into a 2014 Toyota Highlander, I can find that knowledge in about 30 seconds. This is unique and has not existed in human experience before now. Well, before like 5 years ago. We have all of that at our fingertips. So we are used to this idea that everything should be where we need it when we need it. And so when we encounter things that are not easily digestible through 3-minute YouTube videos, that can be a struggle for us. And when we recognize that some things actually take longer to learn, that I may know how to do something, but actually practicing and be good at it takes a whole lot more time. Kimberly can no doubt in about a minute and a half sit down and show me the basics of how the piano works. That does not mean I'm going to be able to play it, nor do you want me to. That takes time and energy and effort and is only achievable through those sorts of means. Taking the longer view, willing to take the time and the energy and effort to put in to gain the real knowledge and the wisdom that only time can bring us. So moving out of this place where we expect to have everything we want the minute we want it at our fingertips, to understanding that some things just take time, and sometimes the time that it takes is not counted in minutes, but is counted in years, and being okay with that. Now, as I was thinking about this idea of empathy and longevity, I thought about a lot of different things. And because it's sort of top of mind, one of the things I was thinking about was my daughter Vivian and I's recent trip to London. And one of the things that we got to do there was something I wanted to do for a long time, which is visit Westminster Abbey. Now, Westminster Abbey, there she is. Westminster Abbey, some version of it has been where it is since the 11th century. And England used to actually have tons of different abbeys and monasteries throughout it. In fact, up until about the 1500s, from about the time of Westminster Abbey up to the 1500s, it came to be that these different monasteries and abbeys and all these different religious organizations owned about 20 to 30% of all of the land in England. They were incredibly large. They had a lot of wealth attached to them. And many of them at that time were several centuries old. And it was up until that point, they were really one of the biggest forces in the area. And of course, this is another one of those things that our good friend King Henry VIII decided to take care of. When he decided to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and form his own thing, the next thing he took is turned his sights to are the abbeys and the monasteries, which is why there's only a handful left in the country anymore. Most of them were shut down, their property was all seized, and the buildings were torn down. So the fact that Westminster Abbey exists and continues to exist is a bit of a miracle. But they got, if you think about it, if we think about how they got there, abbeys and monasteries did not start that way, right? Mostly, what do you know about people like nuns and monks and stuff who live at abbeys and monasteries? One of the things that they are known for are things like taking a vow of poverty. And so it's a wonder, like, well, how is it that they ended up in the way that they did? And the idea and the simple fact is they didn't immediately end up there. The fact that they were as strong and as wealthy as they were at the time of King Henry was because they'd been around for centuries, and the work that they were doing and trying to do, they measured not in minutes and hours, but measured in years and generations. And what you had at the time at abbeys and monasteries were the product of generations and generations and generations of people over the spans of several centuries working and endeavoring to do the work that they themselves felt God had called them to do. Now, in the Methodist Church, we don't have abbeys and monasteries or things like that anymore. And though you will still find them in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. So it's not something that most of us are familiar with or spend a lot of time thinking about because it's not something that is part of our religious life today. But for centuries, they were a strong part of the Christian tradition. And they filled a specific role at the time. Now, at the time, about the same time that Westminster Abbey was being built by the Benedictine monks, there was another guy named Francis of Assisi, also known as St. Francis, who was probably one of the most famous of the people who started one of these monastic traditions as we know them. Now, Francis is interesting for a lot of reasons, but what's interesting about Francis, he was not born poor, even though that's what he would eventually be known for. He was actually born to a very rich and noble class of people. He had a very simple life. He had a very comfortable life growing up. He wasn't expected to do much, even though he was able to get access to an education because he was rich at a time when nobody else could get access to an education. And he traveled the world and really lived the life of what we would call, in today's world, like the life of kind of like a modern playboy. He just kind of went around to place, living life large, because he had been born into a place of wealth and means. One of the places he visits, though, in this process is Rome. And he visits the church in Rome because he came from a fairly religious family. And the thing that struck him while he was there was while there was all this wealth on display in the Vatican and all these other places, right outside the door were all these other people, including a lot of people who lived by begging for money for folks as people walked in and out of all of these high religious places. And Francis wanted to understand, for some reason got curious and wanted to understand why that is and why people were living in that way. And he wanted to know what the real experience of living in that way was. So he actually found a person who was on the street begging, and he gave the guy some money and asked him if he could trade clothing. And so the guy went off with all of his fine, wares and everything, and a handful of money. And Francis put on the guy's rags and got himself all dirty, and spent the next several days living as he lived. And he was really taken aback by how he experienced all of that. And he was struggling with that reality in the reality of what he understood his faith and what he understood Jesus to teach us to do, especially how Jesus taught us about the poor and how we are relate to them. And so Francis decided to do something about it. And the thing that he decided to do, because it was something that apparently you did at the time, is he went off to decide to live a life dedicated to serving the poor. And he thought, I can't do that unless I'm living as they live. And so he decided to take a vow of poverty and ended up attracting other people who were interested in the same thing, interested in doing the same thing. And out of that, we get the Franciscan order of monks and nuns and all of that. Now, we again don't think about a lot of this today because it is not a strong part of our life. And in fact, a lot of these kind of like monastic orders are not nearly as strong as they used to be. However, there was a time, a few centuries after Francis, when we all should be very grateful that these groups existed. You may know that if you know your history at all, you know about the 11th century. You start going to the centuries that follow. Those are known as the Middle Ages or the Intertier period, or sometimes they are known as the Dark Ages, right? And they're known as the Dark Ages because it wasn't actually necessarily a very pleasant time. It wasn't a time when humanity made a lot of progress. There wasn't a lot of time when a lot of discoveries were made, and we call it that for a reason. And of course, if we know anything about, remember back to our like 6th grade history class, the thing that kind of breaks us out of the Dark Age period is what we would eventually call the Renaissance, right? And we call it the Renaissance because it was a rediscovery. And what they rediscovered at that time was a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the wisdom that came before. A lot of the Greek thinkers and Roman thinkers and philosophers and all that sort of stuff. The theologians from the 1st and 2nd century, all these writings about Christ, all of that stuff, that is what people in the Renaissance were rediscovering. And most of us know that from history class. What we don't know from history class is, and isn't always pointed out in history class, is how that stuff was rediscovered. It wasn't as if people for centuries had had a copy of Plato or Aristotle on their shelves and were ignoring it. That's not how it worked. When we rediscovered and then decided to apply all of this stuff that we had learned before, we had to go somewhere to find it. The only place that existed was in the monasteries. The only people who were valuing this knowledge and this information, recognizing it as important to humanity, recognizing it's like we're going to need this again someday and hold on to it and preserve it. The only group of people in Europe doing that were the monks and the nuns in the monasteries and the abbeys. The fact that we got to rediscover all of this, the fact that scientists and Newton got to rediscover Aristotle and everything else, the fact that Luther got to rediscover the 1st and 2nd century theologians that meant so much to him, the reason all of that even was there to be had were these people who had spent the last several centuries making loving, faithful copies by hand of all of these books so that knowledge wouldn't be lost. So while today we may say, I'm not sure what good or what the purpose of monasteries and abbeys are today, and that's fine, though I mean there is still some. The truth is, we get to be here knowing everything we know because those folks who were not overly concerned with their own well-being, who had empathy for those around them, empathy not only for them around them now, but empathy for the generations ahead that may need to know all this stuff that they knew. And also were willing to take the long view to say, I'm going to dedicate my life and years of my life to copying down this book that nobody's ever going to read, hoping that someday somebody might find it and be able to read it again. Now, whether they knew at the time that it was going to be as important as it is, we probably don't know. And why they were inspired to do it, even though for many people it probably felt pretty futile at the time, we won't know. But we all owe them a little bit of a debt of gratitude. And we can find examples of this throughout history when people step out of their own world and start to ask the really hard question, what's going on around me? Why are other people seem to be struggling more than I am struggling? How do I really understand it? How do I move past the default assumptions about why things are the way they are? Those are the people, like Francis, who are oftentimes able to set things in motion that will mean so much to us to follow. Another example of this, real quick, is a gal from the late 19th century called Beatrice Webb. And she herself was born to, similar to Francis, a wealthy family, a noble family in England. She grew up in a religious household. She had deep faith in God, and yet she looked around her world at the time and decided to ask the question, why is it that her life was so comfortable and other people's lives was not? and what are the struggles that those people are really dealing with. And of course, she was given a lot of the standard answers that people gave at the time, which was full of assumptions and not a lot of direct knowledge. So Beatrice decided to do something very similar to what Frances did. She decided to actually go dress the part of a poor woman of the time and actually spent 2 years working in a textile mill to learn what it was like to work in a textile mill and what struggles families faced at the time. Beatrice would go on to be one of the founding members of the London School of Economics and would start many movements and different things and really bring a lot of attention and awareness to what people were really dealing with. And was one of the people who actually helped develop some policies in place that helped England develop a true middle class, which they didn't really have at the time. There were a handful of people at the top and pretty much everybody else in the bottom and very few people in the middle. And because of Beatrice and other people like her, they were able to actually build the middle class that most of us would consider ourselves belonging to today. She couldn't have done that if she wasn't willing to have empathy for those around her, to recognize that she didn't know what she didn't know, and be willing to take some pretty extreme steps to learn what it is that she needed to know. She also was willing to take the long view and recognize that there were no quick fixes to what it is that she was seeing. But instead of despairing about the fact that there were no quick fixes about what do you do when you have all of these people struggling in all these different ways, she rolled up her sleeves and decided to live by something that we talk about a lot here. She recognized that she couldn't do everything to fix all the problems in front of her. So she decided to do the something she could do. Now, we are not all called to go and, live in poverty for months or years at a time. Thankfully. We are called to ask ourselves the questions from time to time when we see something in the world that is not as it should be. Is there something going on here that I'm not seeing? Is there a reason things are this way for me or these people or whoever it is that is outside of my experience to understand? And if there is, then how is it that I can learn to understand it? Somewhere along the way in the world of education, we decided to look beyond what was happening just in the classroom and recognize what was going on in students' homes informed a lot about what was happening in the classroom. And so school districts and schools today spend a lot more time and a lot more energy helping students with things that are actually happening outside of the classroom because we know that that's necessary to help them achieve inside. We didn't always ask those questions. I'm glad that we ask those questions now. I'm glad that we have systems in place, even though we're not perfect at it and there's no doubt more work to do. I'm glad that we have systems in place to do that. No doubt more students have been able to achieve far beyond what they would have been able to achieve before. Wisdom is about a lot of things, but one of the things that we understand, if wisdom is about having the mind of God and thinking in the way God thinks, one thing we know for sure is that God, no doubt, has endless empathy for us, who we are, and what it is we're going through. And God has endless empathy for our neighbors, the ones we understand and the ones we don't. God also takes not just the short view, but God's view on the world and where things are heading is so much broader and so much longer than ours than we can comprehend. God cares about where we are right now and what's going on in our lives right at this moment. But God's also looking at the world unfolding, not just what's going to happen tomorrow, but God is no doubt seeing months, years, and even centuries down the way. He inspired, no doubt, those monks and those nuns to endeavor a task that may be fruitful to them, knowing there would come a time when we would need that knowledge again. So if we are going to live with wisdom, then we should expect to do no different. To do what we can, to be as empathetic as we can, to put ourselves in the shoes of other people as much as we can, and also to recognize that everything is probably magically not going to be better tomorrow, but with time and faith and hard work and open hearts, things can be better in the days, the weeks, and the years to come. That is living with God's mind, and that is living with wisdom. Amen.